Okay, a big topic this week. It's a tiny couple words in the Parsha, but as I looked into it, it kept getting bigger and bigger. Probably bigger than our half hour, but at least we will start. So there's a medrash on the very beginning of the Parsha. Right? It says that Moshe Rabeinu, right, explained the Torah ba'er heitei. Right? It says be'ever yarden posuk hey. Be'ever yarden beretz Moav hoyel Moshe be'eres haTorah zos lemor. He started to explain the Torah. What is this ba'er? So Rashi brings down from the medrash shivim loshon in 70 languages. Okay, throughout Chazal we find this primal idea of 70 nations, 70 languages. Question is, why is Moshe Rabeinu explaining the Torah in 70 languages? Right? To who? Right? I saw the Shem Shmuel said they spoke either Hebrew or Egyptian. Right? That was probably it. So what's going on? What's happening there? So the Medrash says that there's a process which is going on. The Medrash connects it to the idea of that there's a machlokes in Maseches Megillah as to whether Svarim, Sifrei Torah, Tanakh could be written in other languages. Okay, the Chachamim say they can be written in any language. Gamliel says only in Yuvanis, only in Greek. And then they continue on like this. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Re'ei l'shona shel Torah ma chaviva. Look how precious is the language of Torah. Shemerap'ah es haloshon, that it heals languages. As it says in Mishlei, there's a pasuk, Marpei Loshon Eitz Chaim. The Eitz Chaim, which is the Torah, is Marpei Loshon. It's the healer of languages. Okay? What does it do? He says, Lashona Shel Torah Matir Es HaLoshon. The Loshon of Torah, so to speak, unties. Lahatir, like Matir Asurim means to release, but it also means to make mutter if something is asur, right? Asur is also a lashon of being tied up, asur bareitim, right? And mutar means something which is untied. So this is what we have to search for and see what's happening. Moshe Rabbeinu was doing something very important here, and it somewhat follows from last week's parsha, right? Because we spoke about the Maseh, about the travels that Am Yisrael did in the Midbar. That those were, on one hand, preparing Am Yisrael for all their different stations in the Golus, and each individual Jew for his travels in his life. So he said that, he brings here, that Achar kol hamasos b'midbar, the Sfas says, after all the travels in the Midbar, shimshichu b'nei Yisrael ha'ora kadosh l'toch kol hamakomas halolu, that Am Yisrael brought a light of Kedusha to all the places. Achar kach ho'il Moshe be'er, now Moshe Rabeinu is bringing the light of Torah into the languages. Okay, now we have to try to see why. So the Sfas Emes, in what's called the Sfas Emes Likutim, in the back of the Sfas Emes, there are things he wrote when he was very young. Right? They're not part of the full Sefer, but they were attached to it. So he says, Avsha l'shonos meruchakim me'akedusha u'betoch ha'klipa. Meaning the languages of the nations are far from Kedusha, and they're in this concept, what's called the klipa, the husk, the external. But HaTorah matir haloshon mimasar klipa. The Torah is able to free every language in the world from that which it is imprisoned in. U'ma'orah hakedusha shabaloshon. And there's Kedusha in every language. And the Torah can awaken the Kedusha that's in every language. Because everything Hashem made has a spark of Kedusha in it. So there's something in explaining Torah in another language which awakens a spark of Kedusha which is in that language, which otherwise would be a very negative thing. The Shem Shmuel brings down a Masara that he heard from the Chidush Yarim, from the first Ger Rebbe, who gave an example. Don't get offended with it. It says that the French language, right, he says, is a language which draws to adultery and immorality, right? The world calls it a very romantic language, right? But the Chazon Ish once said, what the world calls romance, we call curries, right? There's different, so he says the language of French draws to that. He says, Sha'uma Tzarfatit, that the French nation, Mishukat Batinuv Zeh Yosem Mishar Umos Kayadua, that they are more involved in these matters in other nations, as is known. Therefore, he says, its language, right, can draw one to it. But, he says, with this idea of the fact that the Torah heals the language of other nations, right, and draws out the spark of Kedusha that's in everything, he says, because the Torah needs all the different languages. And when the Torah needs a language in order to explain it to Jews who speak that language, he says, then, he mechuberet l'tahar. That language becomes connected to tahara, v'nidche hara mikirba. And the evil is somewhat expunged from it. And tahara comes in. That's refuah of the lashon. He says, and that's why I think Rashi threw in those French words in his Perush all the time. He said, couldn't he have just continued to explain it in Hebrew? If someone's reading Rashi, he's got to have pretty good Hebrew. Okay? The whole Perush is in Hebrew. But every now and then he puts in, this is what we call this in French, or that in French. So he says, he thinks with that Rashi was, he says, untying the French language from some of its tumah. He says it even could very well be that, it had worse influence before Rashi fixed it up some, and it's not as powerful now as it used to be. Okay, so he says that is partly how this works. Now, it's not just, okay, so this is a very important thing, that we see the fact that Torah, languages are used for Torah. And again, we recognize that there are many more than 70 languages, but these are all branches and branches and combinations of these primary languages that are there. And as the Torah travels through the world, as we travel in our Golos, the Torah goes into different languages. The Torah must express itself in different languages, even though that's limiting. Every language, no language can compare to Lashon HaKodesh for expressing ideas of Torah. I was once, Moshe Shapiro mentioned that somebody asked him about making a translation into English of the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim. Sefer Nefesh HaChaim by Reb Chaim Mivolozhin is, many of the chapters involve a lot of Kabbalah, of concepts from Kabbalah and such. And Reb Moshe said, I told him I'm against it. He said, why? He says, because it's a book all about Elokus. Elokus, I guess you could call godliness. He says, and the terms in English that are used for discussing those things all have Christian connotations. If you start, describing those things, the divine presence sanctifies and elevates the holiness of you feel like you're in church. He said, the words, he felt that they weren't appropriate. On the other hand, they say, I saw the Lubavitcher Rebbe writing on Parshas Devarim said that his father-in-law, the Riyatz, the previous Rebbe, when he came to America, he was very enthusiastic that they should translate Sifrei Chasidus into English. He says because he felt that by doing so, that would enable American Jews to be able to connect to Pnimius HaTorah. Right? That again, this idea of healing the language by putting these things in there is an interesting thought. Okay, so this was the Shem Yishmol, and the Shem Yishmol finishes with a practical bit of Eitzah. He says, the Kotzker Rebbe mentioned, at one point there was a gezerah in Poland that nobody could get married unless they spoke the Polish language. So he said, so they gave the kids in Cheder, they gave them some basic Polish, right, so that when it came time for them to get married, and sometimes they got married extremely young in those days, you could have the bar mitzvah and the wedding on the same night sometime, so that you would be able to do that. So the Kotzker Rebbe said, I learned the language, but I was very careful to make sure that it didn't influence me. He said, so this is his warning to people who have to learn different languages for their profession and things like that. Realize that a language has character, has power, has influence. If you're aware of that, if you're forewarned, then you're able to be careful with it and then to utilize it in the way that it should be. Okay, it's very important. It was very important in America when Rabbanim began to speak in English. Right, people caught up with a gap. There were young people in America. You had European rabbis in the shul or teaching in the schools and such, and these were American kids. And the rabbi either spoke Yiddish or very, very broken English. Now again, there are some that just their character alone overcame all language differences. I've seen that. There was one European Rav that I saw that it just, people, his heart overcame all of it. His English was very broken. He was very eloquent in Yiddish, but nonetheless, that came through. But the ability to be able to do and to reach people in that way. Yisrael Salanter, they said each country he went to, and his biography is fascinating. He was an outreach rabbi, so to speak. He went from Lithuania to Germany, to France, and also parts of Russia. He always tried to learn the language well where he was going to be. His Talmud, Rebitzel Peterburger, Rebitzel Blazer, who became the Rav of St. Petersburg, a very big city, he told him early on to make sure that he mastered the Russian language because he would need to intercede with the government and such. That was going to be part of who he is. So there's certainly needs and ways to do it. But here we're looking at it in a more far-reaching sense. Moshe Rabeinu here, in Arvos Moav, is now explaining the Torah in all 70 languages because he knows that Am Yisrael may end up any place in the world. And they're going to be in a world of another language. And the Torah has to be able to reach them, and they have to be able to reach the Torah. And that's what he was doing there with this expression. There's an interesting document, they call it the Kutzker Kvittel. It was something in Gera. I didn't manage to get a handle on the whole content of this Kvittel. But it brings there the following. It says, I think this comes from the Imre Emes. It says, Moshe Rabeinu, when he was explaining the Torah, here we'll say it in Yiddish, right, which is not one of the 70 languages, but one that Jews came up with, right? In their particular, they fixed up the German or whatever else they were mixing in. He said, Moshe Rabbeinu had gegraben azoyin tifkeit from the Torah, that Moshe Rabbeinu dug so deep into the depth of Torah, afilu as a yud vet reinfallen in alle taives verse, in alle midos verse, in alle shivimumos, that even if a Jew falls deep, deep, deep into the worst taivas and the worst negative midos of any of the 70 nations in the world, zoam der tzaddik adora rauszunehmen von shol tachtis durch den koich von der Torah. That a tzaddik of the door, right, would be able to, in other words, kind of stepping in from Moshe Rabbeinu, this idea that the tzaddikim of each door are the continuation of Moshe Rabbeinu, they will be able to communicate with, connect with Jews that are so far and so deep in another language, in another culture, in the worst aspects of it, and to be able to pull them out with the power of Torah. He planted this in there. It's planted now in every language in the world, so that nobody can be to an extent that there's a communication gap, that the Torah can't reach them. There is a way for the Torah to reach everyone, and it's something that we have to have hope in and to know and to understand. A little bit more in terms of what this does. So Emes in another place explains that this actually is a process which helps enhance and increase the Torah itself. Right? He says, as the Torah's purpose is to spread out in the world, to spread out into all areas of life. Right? Kimi Tzion Teitzei Torah. He said when the Chachamim say this beautiful thing that Sichas Chulim Shel Talmidei Chachamim Tzrichim Limud. Right? If you hear two Talmidei Chachamim talking about, I don't know, what kind of car to buy, right, or where they're going on vacation, pay attention and learn from it. Why? Because, this I saw, we'll get to in a second, the Shirei Das from Telz, who talks about this idea. He says, really what it means, he's talking about Chachma, Bina, and Das. What it means that Talmud Chacham that truly absorbs Torah means, it's not what we call, what do we call it now, artificial intelligence or anything like that. It's not just a database of facts. It actually melds together with him that his entire mind, psyche, emotion, and even his body becomes Torah. So, therefore, when he discusses anything in the world, it's the Torah interacting with that thing. So you should pay attention to it. And that's a process which is supposed to be. And he says when that happens, when the Torah extends in that way, then the very well springs of Torah open up and even more Torah comes into the world. So therefore, it seems like a terrible part of Golus and the challenge that Am Yisrael are found in different cultures, in different languages, and different things. But if we manage to bridge the gaps in the way that we're supposed to, so then that actually brings bracha and open up the well springs of Torah itself. It's interesting just that Bloch explains that idea of the Talmud Chacham is why you see in the Gemara that they would say, I got my Chacham because I saw a Rebbe from the back of his head, and I saw the finger of this one. What are they talking about? He says, because the actual physicality of the person became Torah. Right? But that's truly the idea, and it's important to know that that's our picture of what a true Talmud Chacham is. Okay, so we have, right, this idea, and now let's try to see how we look at these things. Are they positive? Are they negative? How do we see them? So the Sfas again says, Vadai kol shivim leshonos yeshlem eza achiza b'Torah. Every one of the 70 languages has some type of connection to Torah. Rak shenispashtu ba'anofim nifrodim, right? Meaning, but they branched off into separate branches. Okay, he explains the very word lashon, right? Lashon seems to make sense for a language because it means tongue. But Chazal used tongue for things of a particular shape, like they talk about tongues of wool, lashonot shel tzemer. And he explains that what's going on here is that if you imagine the ocean, so the ocean will sometimes spread out and then leave these little isolated lagoons, right, or different areas of water. So he says then sometimes if the ocean extends itself, and that water oftentimes becomes stagnant, right, because it doesn't have the healthy processes of the ocean. But then when the water of the ocean flows and connects with it, then it also becomes healthy and healed, so to speak. So he says, therefore, this is what the Torah is doing here with these different languages. All languages come from the mother language, so to speak, of Lashon HaKodesh. Right? It's all there. But these Lashonos, these little streams, these little lagoons that are out there are limited. He says, only when the Torah comes and utilizes those languages, right, and connects with them, then they're able to connect to the Torah. And then Am Yisrael, who, even if they're living in a world of that language, are able to be connected to the true essence of Torah. Yeah, sure.
I thought that at the Migdal Babel, there was the Babel de Lashonos, and they just bumped into different languages. You're saying that they come from that language?
Yeah. In other words, one of these stories that I have, they were quoted that until Migdal Babel, everything was Lashon HaKodesh. Right. And that idea of the branching out are all somewhat from there, right? And they talk about, again, if you know Yoni Moses, and so his brother wrote this book called The Word. And he said now it's expanded to a website with even more things. It's a fascinating book. It shows how many words in English, and oftentimes it's based on the Latin roots of English or other roots of English, originally come from Hebrew. Right? Many of them really do seem to make sense. Some of them seem like a bit of a stretch. And they say that you can find these things throughout. It's also these strange appearances, Chazal say, of words from another language that appear in the Torah, like totafot, right? Rashi brings down that tat ba'afriki means two and different things. Hein, they say the word hein, right? Hein la Shem Elokecha means one in Greek. There are different things that are there. So they explain that these are connections that are made in order to enable us to deal with those different nations and languages and cultures which are there. Okay, so here, this is a very important thing as we're in the 3 weeks and thinking about the idea of Golus. Golus is not the way the non-Jews look at it as a punishment, right, as torture, that Hashem wants to simply, get revenge on us for what we did. That's part of the whole theology, you rejected the Son of God and therefore you're sent out to wander and to suffer. Golus is purposeful. Golus is things that we must accomplish. Now it could be we could have accomplished these things in different ways when the Beis Hamikdash was standing and Am Yisrael was in Eretz Yisrael. Now Rosh Hashiva always said, we were speaking about the idea of why don't people push the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach? Right? Chabad is the only group I know that somewhat does hand out cards in different languages, trying to explain to people about the 7 Noahide laws, what they call them, mitzvahs b'nei Noach. The simplest reason usually people bring is it's dangerous. Right? In other words, throughout the world there are many religions that don't take kindly to people telling members of their religion that this isn't what you're supposed to be doing. Well, it's fascinating that there are many more Bnei Noach in the world now than there have been probably for any time known. Now they're able to contact each other. And there are people who write a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch for Bnei Noach. Yeah, there's halachas that are there. You look it up, these Noahides, some of them are very, very fascinating people and that really want to do it right. And so the way it's supposed to happen, he says, is the way it was with Shlomo HaMelech and Malka Shva. Shlomo HaMelech had set up, that was a small flash in Jewish history where we kind of had our existence as it was meant to be. We were in Eretz Yisrael, we were doing the right thing, we had the Beis HaMikdash, and you see Malka Shva says, I heard about you people. I heard about what's here. I heard about your king, your wisdom, all these things I came to see. That's really the way it's supposed to be. So, meaning that it isn't necessarily built into our history that we had to scatter to every part of the world and every language of the world in order to accomplish this, but in our reality, that's where it is. And there's a latent kedusha in every language which is out there, that the very fact that Torah is being used for it in some way or another to connect that one Jew is repairing that language. And eventually we know, the Navi says, that all languages are going to switch to be Safa Achas, right? It will again return to be one language, L'kro b'Shem Hashem, to call out in the name of Hashem. That's part of Am Yisrael's destiny and the job that we're doing as well. So that's also happening with this. So it's important to see this in terms of our picture of Golus and what we're doing in Golus, right? That there are positive things that we are doing, that there were things that the Torah implanted already in the world, preparing in case Am Yisrael had to go out to Golus, so that we would be able to survive and thrive and even influence where we are. Now, I wanted to just conclude with Rav Bloch's description of this idea of the Shivim Lashon. And again, it's part of a bigger piece, and it's kind of a deep idea, but he explains that this is something having to do with being able to really transmit something to a person in the way that they understand, and being able to understand someone who's asking you something. Yeah, this is Rav Bloch in the Shirei Das. So he says, why is it that Moshe Rabeinu taught them in 70 Lashon? Why? Wouldn't one language get it all across? He says, you don't know, what difference does it make to explain in all these languages? So he says, you're right, that in order to just give information, perhaps that would be enough with one language. But he says, Chazal realized that every one of these languages, of these primary languages that exist in the world, right, these express things in a different way. And things that come from the human nature, okay? And therefore, each one shows a different facet. Moshe Rabbeinu explained the Torah according to all those different facets. He says, it's true, information could be given with one language, but there are different nuances, different ways, and it has to do with the fact that there are different people and different personalities. That's why one of the qualifications for Sanhedrin, it says, Ein Moshivim b'Sanhedrin, ala balikoma, balichochem, amara, etc., yodim b'shivim lashon. The Sanhedrin had to know 70 lashonos. They would tell us that Yosef knew the 70 lashonos. Why? He says, he thinks that Chachamenu b'ruach kodesh, with the ruach HaKodesh of the Chachamim, they understood that the power of speech inside of a person has 70 different, so to speak, branches of that power of speech. That through those ways, people can express their thoughts. He says, and not just information, but actually the real neshama of an idea. Okay, he says each of those 70 ones really interacts with that idea, connects with that idea in a very unique and deep way. So therefore, he says, the Sanhedrin had to truly understand when someone was coming and giving to them something. It's true, you can get the information through a translator. but you want to get the soul of what this person's saying. You want to really understand that in that way, so therefore they have to know that. Okay, so he says this is something Yosef also needed to know as a person who was going to influence the entire world, right? He had to be able to understand those different things. So therefore, he spreads this out to the idea, again, of teaching Torah. He says that Talmud Chacham, right, is supposed to know, so to speak, those 70 languages of Torah. And to be able to interact with people and to find part of the art of teaching, of transmitting, of learning, is to find the way in which this connects with the person. To find the way, that's why a person, not everyone learns from the same person, right? There's a different language which is necessary for each person and their uniqueness. Yosef Yudalei Bloch himself, it was a fascinating story, that he was brilliant even at a young age. And the Alter Slobodka, who'd been a Talmid of the Alter of Kelm, he hadn't yet had his own yeshiva. He had a yeshiva for younger boys in Kelm. What was called the Talmud Torah in Kelm, the famous Kelm yeshiva, was for older Bachrim. Much older Bachrim were already accomplished Talmidei Chachamim. And they had like their farm club, if you want to use baseball terminology, which was also there for the juniors. So the Alter Slobodka of Dosen Tzvi Finkel was supposed to keep his eye out for talented young men. And he noticed this Yosef Yudalei Bloch was incredibly talented. So he brought him at a young age already to meet the Alter of Kelm. And the Alter of Kelm was very impressed with him. And he gave him something that almost no one had. Full access to any of his shiurim. In Kelm, only certain Talmidim were invited to certain shiurim. It was kind of exclusive. You can come to this one, but not to that one. You can come to this one. He was able to come to all of them. And he was going to the shiurim for a while, and then he stopped. And he just sat in his own yeshiva. Now there started to be mumblings in the yeshiva that maybe he became a maskil. Maybe the Haskalah influenced him. Because why in the world would somebody not be running to hear from the Alter of Kelm? And this was happening in yeshivas all over the place. Right? So at one point he got up in the Beis Medrash, he banged on the table. He says, I bow my head, I have that absolute respect for the Alter of Kelm. He says, but his way is not my way. That's not my language. Right? He needed to receive from someone else, a different language. That turned out to be Blazer Gordon, who became his father-in-law, who was the Rav of Telz before him, and from him he got. So that's also in the world of Torah. There are different languages, and sometimes really you look at another person's language of Torah when you don't understand what they're talking about. Realize that doesn't mean it's not legitimate, right? Obviously some things are illegitimate, but within the world of Torah there are many legitimate languages, and a person has to find the language which is right to them, what Chazal call Mashalibo Chafetz. So in all our wanderings, physical, spiritual, linguistically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu help us connect up the right way and be able to bring everything back home where it's supposed to be.